Hi, everybody. How's that sound? Can you hear me okay? Do we need to go up? It's good? Just a little up? Right? Okay. I don't know where my sound guy went, but do we need to turn it up just a hair, maybe? Good. So my husband said to me, make sure you tell everyone right off the bat what the connection is to what you do with why we're here, right? Because when you look at something like that, it doesn't necessarily seem like it correlates to the idea of eating well and eating healthy and being healthy. And I'd just like to share my experience. I've developed a method that basically creates more coherence in your biofield. And I'll explain that later, what that means. But the effect of having a coherent biofield is that your systems are organized. And when your systems are organized, your digestive fire is strong. And you can enjoy food. So I used to have dairy intolerance, wheat intolerance, gas, bloating, heartburn, stomach aches, that sort of thing. And since I have trained people in my method and I've been able to receive that work, I no longer have any of those problems. Not heartburn, no bloating, nothing. And I haven't changed my diet. I've been able to, I eat bread and I enjoy raw dairy that is illegally delivered to my home here in Vermont, in my garage. And I can do that with gusto. I travel back and forth between here in California, where I see clients and I teach. And, eating bread in California is like an act of heresy, because everybody is gluten-free out there. So I actually relish the fact that I can eat anything and everything and really enjoy it. I think of my digestive tract like a wood stove and food like wood. And so, as long as your fire is strong, you can just burn anything. So that is the direct correlation between my work and caring about food and caring about a good diet. And as we go through, and I'll explain to you like how and why this works in your body the way it does. So Trey introduced me. I'll just tell a little bit about my journey and how I came to have written this book that I wrote. I've been interested in health and wellness since I was a teenager. I, like many teenage American girls, ended up obsessed with food and body image and weight that turned into a full-blown eating disorder. I was bulimic between the ages of 17 and 20. Had a very, very twisted, unhealthy relationship with food and my body. And as a consequence of that, really wanted to figure out how to become healthy. And so when I was about 18, I started reading self-help books, diet books, and then that ended up going into the sort of science and spirituality and human potential movement. And by the time I was 20, I had amassed enough information in that realm to overcome my bulimia. But it took me another 8 years. Becoming a yoga instructor was a big help in that, to actually get into a healthier relationship with food and my body. But as part of that process in my own healing journey, I went to massage therapy school and did that for a year. But prior to that, I started a restaurant. So I started a 16-seat cafe in a town called Pomfret, Connecticut in 1989 called the Vanilla Bean Cafe. And it was my mother who made quiche, really good quiche back in the 80s, and two of my older brothers and myself. And so when we started, it was just the four of us. And within 4 years, we had 140 seats and 32 employees. And I had lost my mind because I had been around food constantly, and we had a very busy, constantly growing business. And it really ruined me. If anybody's really worked really hard starting a business, you know that you have to put in long hours on your feet. And I ended up with TMJ, really severe, back pain, really severe, burnt out adrenals, and depression, just burnout. And so I decided to leave the restaurant for a little while, and I went to massage therapy school, which was very helpful and very healing. And when I came back to the restaurant, I had learned more about boundaries and not working quite so hard. And so I started a small massage therapy practice just on the side, just to kind of keep myself in the realm of wellness while taking care of the restaurant too. And I'm a researcher by nature, so when I get interested in a particular topic, I will read everything I can find on that topic. And so I had read the book Quantum Healing by Deepak Chopra. And in that book, he introduces the concept that everything is vibration, the sort of quantum concept that even though everything appears solid, when you get right down to it, everything is just fields of frequency, patterns of rhythms. And then I came across a book on the use of color and sound and music in healing, vibrational healing. And I thought to myself, well, if everything is vibration, and I'm vibration, then treating vibration with vibration makes a lot of sense. It's very logical. So I went out, and this was back in '96, and I got everything I could find on the subject of vibrational healing. I read a whole bunch of books, and then I got a catalog in the mail that had a set of tuning forks for healing in it. And so on impulse, I ordered them. And I had some massage clients that I was comfortable enough with to say, will you be a guinea pig? Will you let me just experiment with these tuning forks with you? And I noticed right off the bat that the very first time I activated a tuning fork and I held it over somebody, now I thought it was going to produce this sort of objective tone, and no matter where I put it, it was going to sound the same. I was very surprised to discover that as I moved a tuning fork around people's bodies, that it produced different sounds depending on where it was. So in some places it might go loud, in other places it might become very soft, some places it sounded like it was full of static or chaos, and that was very intriguing to me. So I made two discoveries in that early stage, and one was the set of tuning forks that I got was the C major scale, okay? And it said that you use the note of C over the root chakra. So these are Vedic symbols for what are called chakras. They're energy centers that correlate with nerve plexuses that run along your spine. So it said you use the note of C over the root D, E, F, G, A, B, and that was how you did it. So I started off doing that. And what I discovered was that in some areas, the tuning fork would go really loud. And I thought, well, I equate that with there's more energy, whatever that is, in that particular place. And if it's going to sound loud anywhere, it should probably sound loud over the nerve center, okay? And I discovered that I could use my tuning fork like a magnet, like you might use a magnet to move iron filings. I could actually take my tuning fork, I could hook into this loud spot, and I could drag it, and it would follow it like iron filings might follow, you know, a magnet. And then it would drop into this energy center, and then it would sound loud right over the energy center. So I developed this little protocol where I would go through kind of close to the body, and I'd find these loud spots, and I called it click, drag, and drop. I would like find them, and I would move them, and I would drop them into the energy center. And I also found that there would be certain areas that sounded full of static. Like let's say someone had a sore shoulder, and I held the fork over it, and it would sound full of static. If I left it there, if I kept going back and kept going back, after a while, the tuning fork would sound clear. So what started happening was people would come back the next week or a couple weeks later, and they'd say, all that pain in my shoulder went away. Can you do that sound thing again? Or I felt so calm and so clear, or I've slept better, or, you know, so people kept saying, do that again. And in very short order, my massage practice just kind of morphed into a sound practice. And I did it part-time. I did this part-time for years. I had no desire to do it full-time. I had no desire to do it as a vocation. And part of it was when I would tell people that I was using tuning forks for healing, right? There's just something about that, isn't there, that makes you go, oh God, like, that is like so woo. I actually had somebody say to me once, you know, of all the woo-woo stuff out there, what you do seems like the most woo-woo. And I was like, I don't want to be that person, right? I mean, I'm very practical, very sensible, very logical. I'm very logic-driven. I'm very efficiency-driven. You know, when you have a busy restaurant I was in the restaurant business for 20 years, like you're all about like what's the shortest distance between point A and point B, what makes sense, you know, that sort of thing. Not airy-fairy at all. So, So I didn't want to be that. And so I just kept it kind of as a hobby. And so in 2002, I sold my share of the restaurant and moved up here to Vermont. And you know, kept doing this on the side, but because food is my background, I started a specialty food business. Has anybody ever heard of or tried Mama's Special Kettle Corn? Yeah. Okay, so I'm Mama. So I started that, and I did that for a few years. But then something happened in my practice, in my tuning fork practice, that changed the whole course of what I was doing. And that was, one day I was working on somebody, and I accidentally discovered one of those loud spots that I moved around, except I discovered it out here, about 2.5 feet away from their body. Now, this particular client had been complaining that she had a sense of pain and pulling in her neck and her jaw, and it went down into her shoulder. And she had been to see an osteopath, a chiropractor, massage, acupuncture. She tried a whole variety of different modalities and hadn't gotten any relief. And it was a fluke, you know, the way that I discovered it, because something happened that made me go over the other side of the room. And on my way back, I activated the tuning fork, and I was walking towards her, and all of a sudden, when I got to be about here, the tuning fork got loud. And when I came out of it, it got soft. And so I went and I investigated. I'm like, wow, here's one of those loud spots, but what the heck is it doing way out here? So I employed the click, drag, and drop technique, and I dragged it in, and I dropped it, and it felt really weird to like tug it, you know, that far, but it got to the throat, and it got sucked in, and I was like, okay, well, that was odd, but anyway, she called me the next day, and she said, Eileen, all of that pain and pulling is gone. It's gone. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. So the next person who came in, I started as far away from them as I could, as my treatment room would allow, which was about 6 feet. And I started combing my tuning forks in towards the body. And I started to discover all kinds of things in this terrain around the body, okay? Now, up until that point, you know, I'd heard about like human energy fields or auras, kind of skeptical, right, about them. Don't really know, you know, people see them, I don't see them. My kids used to see them. Did anybody have kids ever tell them that like they see colors around people? I don't know if they inherited, you know, but both my kids up until they were like 10 could see colors around people. But so I started to find things that felt like walls, that felt like channels, like all kinds of information that was in there. And prior to this, I had had the experience of, you know, when the tone changed in the tuning fork, like sometimes it would really sound like a particular emotion. In music, a minor third is generally understood to be sad, right? You hear a minor third, you're like, oh, that's sad. Like there's certain tones and certain expressions in music that evoke different emotions. And that was what I was finding in the tuning forks, was that in certain areas it would sound sad, or it would sound angry, or it would sound frustrated, or it would sound lonely, you know? And I would say to people, you know, this is what I'm hearing, does that resonate for you, you know? And people would always concur that it did. So, when I started exploring this area, like out here, I started to discover that every time I heard a sad tone that seemed to have a sad story associated with it, it was always in the same spot. So I kept finding all of the sad stories out here, okay? Now, one of the things that I work with, that I talk about in my book, is my intuitive process. And I read this in somebody else's book. He was describing his experience of his intuition, and he described it as like having one of those little mail slots that you have in a door, you know, M-A-I-L slot in the back of his head, and that sometimes his mail slot would open and a note would drop in, and the note would have information, and if, you know, it was generally like a direction, like do this, or this is this, or that, you know, and if he listened to it and he followed it, it would give him a good outcome. So in my work, I kind of had that same experience. I'd get into an area where the tone would distort and sound funky, and my mail slot would open and a note would drop in, and it would say something like sadness, age 12. And so I would say to the person on the table, you know, was there something really sad that happened when you were 12? And they would say, yeah, that's when my dad died. I'm like, okay, that's a big sad experience, right? So through this sort of mail drop experience, and this took years for it to happen, but I uncovered and this is purely subjective research. This is my own senses. I've yet to successfully apply science to this hypothesis, okay? But I have taught it to hundreds of people who have found the same thing. It is replicable. Your field, if you will, and we'll describe what that is, appears to be where all your memories live. And they live in very specific areas. So your field is actually stratified, and different emotions, different memories all have different frequency signatures. And so your memory puts all the sad ones that have that vibration go there, and all the angry ones go there, and all the worry about the future goes here. And this very distinct anatomy began to emerge. I call it the Biofield anatomy. The other part of the anatomy is that it appears to be timelined, in that as we generate information, so you go through your day and you're having your mental experiences, what you're thinking, how you're thinking, the speed at which you're thinking, right? You're having your emotional experiences, what you're feeling, you know, are you angry, are you sad, are you frustrated, right? You're having all of that happen. Your physical experiences, oh, you know, I just fell and got a really big bruise on my knee. And all of that is all frequency. It's all vibrational patterning. It's almost like we generate it like an EEG readout. And it seems to me that it gets laid down in standing waves within this magnetic medium that surrounds your body. And as we generate information, it moves away from us. So I use my tuning forks kind of like an invisible ink decoder. And as I pass them through your field, they're interfacing with this information that's stored in these standing waves. So the information that's out of the outer edge of your field holds the vibrational patterning and information from gestation, from birth, earliest childhood, and then everything else falls in between, like rings in a tree. So if you're 40, information I would find halfway through your field would be related to when you were 20. Okay? So what I've been able to do with this work is to access historical traumas that are precognitive. You know, so many of our deep traumas actually come from in utero, from infancy, from a traumatic birth. A lot of people's stress response has a lot to do with what your birth experience was. And so the tuning forks work in a couple different ways. They are diagnostic in that they help me to find these areas of distortion. But they're also therapeutic in that by simply placing a coherent input into an incoherent area, very specifically in the field, your body will use that coherent input to auto-tune or auto-adjust itself. And so over the years that I've been doing this, these are just some of the things that I've treated successfully. So pain, you know, psychosomatic pain is the kind of pain that you get that's a consequence of tension, of some kind of mental or emotional pain. It's very hard to treat from a conventional method. But because it's pattern related, it's simply, you know, a rhythm that's off. And by giving the body the opportunity to correct its rhythm, it can resolve. I've had people who've had pain for 30 years have it go away in just one treatment. Anxiety, you know, anxiety, it's an oscillatory pattern in your body and in your field. I recently treated a woman who had had terrible anxiety her whole life, really, really severe anxiety, and she'd been in and out of therapy, she'd been on and off meds, and had never really gotten anywhere. And she had sort of an associated depression and a feeling of like, what's wrong with me? You know, why can't I do anything about this? And so within 5 minutes of having her on my treatment table, I found a huge distortion 5 feet off of her right knee. The right knee holds information related to how we feel when we encounter obstacles moving forward. And there was a tremendous amount of distortion in the outer edge of her field relating to birth. And so I said to her, did you have an extremely traumatic birth? And she said, yeah, like I almost died, my mom almost died, like the whole hospital was in an uproar. It was about as traumatic as it possibly could have been. And I said, well, this is your problem. In that moment, your very first experience out in the world, you bored out your nervous system all the way into the red. You revved, right? Your inner tachometer went, phew. And so now, every time you have a stress response, that's where you go. You go all the way into the red. And that's just pathways that get laid down early become the pathways of our life. Energy moves along established pathways. That's why it's so hard to break habits, because it's just your default setting. You just go there, okay? So simply by knowing where to put that tuning fork in that very specific area, like who'd think, right? 5 feet off your right knee is the source of your anxiety, but that's where it was in her record. And so after just one treatment, and I spent about 15 or 20 minutes hanging out in that particular area until the body and the field, it just resolves, it settles down, it harmonizes through the physics principles of resonance and entrainment. So initially it will resonate with the distortion that's present, but because it's a stronger input, it will bring the body, it will entrain the body into a more coherent expression, a more appropriate rhythm. And she came back the next week and she said, my anxiety is diminished by about 80%. And when I do feel it, I know where it came from, so I'm not beating myself up on top of it, and I'm able to get through it more quickly. And after just 3 sessions, she came back and she said, it's gone. It's just gone, right? So this is a person who would have been, potentially a lifetime on pharmaceutical drugs to try to manage it, but aren't getting anywhere near to where the source point is, which is where it arose, in the historical record. Post-traumatic stress disorder is like a wall of noise around people's heads. When people have encountered more traumatic stressors than they can process, it's almost like the whole brain is lit up. And so much is going on in the brain that other things can't be processed. And so this very simple exercise of combing tuning forks very, very slowly in towards the head, getting the brain waves to settle down. I describe it as sort of like a big house where every light and every appliance and every TV and every radio is on. And it's just too much, right? And so this very simple process just calms and smooths out the brain waves, turns off those appliances, and makes it easier for people to handle more inputs after that. Adrenal stress, this is a very simple thing, and I've really learned to see that everything in your body is a rhythm. Everything is moving in rhythm, right? We think about your heart rhythm, your respiratory rhythm, your digestive rhythm, menstrual rhythms. But really, every single organ, every gland, every system has rhythms, right? Most of us know about brain waves, right? The delta, theta, beta, alpha brainwave states, right? Those are all speeds. They're all just rhythms that your brain moves at. People who suffer adrenal stress, their adrenal rhythm is too high and it's too fast. And if you've been under prolonged stress, then your adrenals just get cranking. Like people who end up tired and wired, right? It's like you can't sleep, you've got insomnia, but you're exhausted, that kind of adrenal exhaustion. You can take supplements, you can take things that will kind of offset that. But I've developed a really simple method that takes about 15 to 20 minutes that resets that adrenal rhythm and brings it back to its proper set point. To just get in there and entrain, hang out with that adrenal rhythm until it becomes self-aware, and then it just kind of self-corrects. And then you just feel a whole lot better. It's almost miraculous. Digestive issues, I talked about that before. I treat a lot of people with digestive issues. Even something like chronic diarrhea. It's just the rhythm of your digestive tract. It's moving too fast. If you have chronic constipation, it's moving too slow, right? I mean, of course it matters what you're eating too, and especially if you're in a compromised situation, you need to modify your diet accordingly. But if that bottom line rhythm issue isn't addressed, then people can often continue to struggle. Depression lives in a very specific area in the field. It sits off the left shoulder. If people have suffered a lot of sadness in their life that they've suppressed or that they haven't been able to digest or to manage, it will just pile up on the left shoulder. Oftentimes people who end up with left shoulder issues just have a lot of undigested sadness hanging out in their field. Fibromyalgia, same thing. Fibromyalgia people, like often cancer people, clients that I've treated who suffer from fibromyalgia tend to put everybody else's needs ahead of their own. They take care of everybody else, they don't speak their truth, they don't speak up for themselves, and their body starts to get tighter and tighter. So part of treating them is treating the throat to get the throat to be more expressive in speaking their truth and speaking up for themselves. And very often, once people start to advocate for themselves, these aches and pains begin to go away. Addiction, fears and phobias. I've had people, come in with phobias of spiders or, all different kinds of fears. Again, it's just a pattern somewhere in the field. Vertigo. Most people I've treated who have vertigo are suffering from emotional overwhelm. They've got so much going on and so many emotions sort of piling up that they just start to become dizzy. And I can very often knock out vertigo in just one session. Same with migraines and headaches, restless leg syndrome. I think the number one thing that I treat is what I call stuckness. And that has to do with the energies moving along particular pathways, right? These sort of habits that we get into, and they're hard to get out of. So let's talk a little bit about, the title here. So we're talking about tuning the human biofield, the missing dimension in healthcare. And this image is considered from Western medical science to be pseudoscientific, to be metaphysical, right? To be woo-woo, right? However, the term is actually from the National Institute of Health. It was a panel of National Institute of Health scientists way back in 1994 that coined the term biofield. And it is the field of energy and information that surrounds and interpenetrates the human body. It's composed of variable energies, electromagnetic and thermal energies, and what they call putative energies. Okay, putative means rumored to be. And these are subtle energies that are as yet unmeasured and undefined by science. So we might call it, from an Eastern perspective, we might call these subtle energies chi or prana. Those are some common words. As far as Western medicine is concerned, these notions are silly and don't exist, okay? So it's also known as the human energy field or aura, and it approximately, on most people, it extends about 5 feet off to the sides and about 2 to 3 feet on the top and bottom. So when I first started moving things around in the field, right, when I was discovering these loud spots, and then when I got out into the field and I started discovering what really felt to me like resistance, that like there was stuff there, and it was resistant. It feel like it was stuck, right? It was usually related to some kind of trauma or scar tissue, actually. So we don't just get scar tissue in our bodies, but we also get scar tissue in our fields. And I could, A, find these areas, B, identify these areas, C, get these areas to shift and to move, right? I started wondering, like, what the heck is this stuff? What am I moving, right? What am I moving, and what laws of physics are governing the fact that I can move this stuff with sound? I went out and I Googled sound is magnetic, because that's what it really seemed to me that it was. And of course it came back nothing, although I recently, just in the last few weeks, came across a scientific study that says that they've actually discovered that sound behaves magnetically. So, so science is starting to catch up with my intuition. So several things happened. Okay, so I started wondering, like, what is this? So I'm moving stuff around people's fields. I'm getting all these really great outcomes, and I'm making popcorn, and it starts to occur to me that I'm onto something with this energy field stuff, and I'm getting such great outcomes. I'm like, I really need to bring this out into the world because this is really neat. But I'm dealing with the fact that it's tuning forks, right? And at this point, I finally figured something out. Because when you get into those conversations like, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I'm a sound healer with tuning forks. And after making popcorn that everybody loved, and after having a cafe that everybody loved, and people were always so enthusiastic when I told them what I did, to be like rejected, but I just couldn't take that. So I started telling people that I'm a researcher who's been studying the effects of audible sound on the human body. And then people were like, oh, you're a scientist. Well, I approve. And then they'd want to know what I'd found, So I realized that because of the image problem, that if I was going to take this out in the world, it would be helpful to have some degrees, okay? So I live in Johnson, And Johnson State College has a wellness and alternative medicine undergraduate program. One of the first in the country. It's actually a really great program. And so I entered into that program and then graduated, and then they have a master's in education program at Johnson as well. And I was very fortunate to have some professors and who were very supportive of me, and I did quite a lot of independent studies all along this topic, and actually wrote a master's thesis called Exploring the Effects of Audible Sound on the Human Body and its Biofield. And it was very challenging to put together an academic document on the use of audible sound, because most of the ways that sound is used in Western medicine, it's sound you can't hear, right? We use ultrasound diagnostically and therapeutically. We use infrasound, sound in the low end of the spectrum to break up kidney stones. It's called lithotripsy, right? But audible sound, not much. So I had to look to other things like music therapy, therapeutic touch, Reiki, other things that were kind of similar but a little bit different to try to put it together. But before I came across the word biofield, I was looking in PubMed, human energy field, coming up with nothing, and thinking, oh my God, what am I doing here? I'm never gonna be able to do this. But then I came across the term biofield, which opened up a whole new frontier for me, and I was actually able to put together this thesis. So I went in with a lot of questions, hoping to find out what it was that I was dealing with in the energy field. And it brought me down a rabbit hole that I absolutely didn't expect to go down. So the conclusion that I came to after reading a lot of books and going to a lot of websites was that the human energy field is what we would call a bioplasma. But in order to understand what a bioplasma is, we need to understand what plasma is, okay? And I'm not talking about blood plasma, I'm talking about the other plasma, the plasma we find in space. Does anybody know about space plasma? So some people do. Okay, most people don't know about plasma, and by the time I get done talking about it, you're going to be really surprised that you didn't know about it, and then you're going to start to see it everywhere. Okay, because recently, just in this last week, this article came out about these giant plasma tubes being found out over the Earth. Did anybody see that? Australian researcher. Okay, you know how many times I got that sent to me? So plasma is everywhere, and you're going to be hearing about it more and more. So, and the way that I even learned about plasma was very serendipitous. So I have two boys, and they are now 17 and 14, but at the time, the older one was 12. And I had given him some books on science for his 12th birthday. He really is into science. And so he came to the dinner table one night and he said, "Did you know that there's a fourth state of matter called plasma?" And I was like, solid, liquid, gas. Nope. No, I never learned about plasma. I missed that one somehow. And in the same conversation, we were talking about space and space being a vacuum, right? And I was like, I'm not sure space is really a vacuum. I think I read somewhere that space isn't a vacuum. And my husband's like, of course space is a vacuum. So I went and I Googled, space is not a vacuum. I love Google. For a researcher, like, I wake up in the middle of the night with questions in my head, I can get them answered right away. It's so exciting. And what did I find in space but plasma? And I was like, well, this is really interesting. So I pretty much spent the next 4 or 5 months reading and learning everything I could about plasma. And it was so exciting to me, like everything that I learned about plasma. I was going to bed at night dreaming about plasma, and I was waking, I was just like, oh my God, this is so exciting. And my husband said to me one day, he's like, you don't love me, you love plasma. I was like, you're right, I do. I've fallen in love with plasma. So, okay, so what is plasma? So it's defined as the fourth state of matter, although it really should be defined as the first state of matter, because everything comes from plasma. In physics and chemistry, plasma is a gas in which a certain portion of the particles are ionized, and that means the electron has split away from the ion, the neutron. The presence of a non-negligible number of charge carriers, these are the free electrons, makes the plasma electrically conductive. Okay? So it's basically a medium that conducts electricity. And this is an image of hydrogen. So that's hydrogen as a gas, where we've got the positive, negative, they've hooked up. And now that's a gas. But when they don't hook up and the electrons are just flowing freely, okay, that's a plasma. So we're going to look at some examples of plasma, all right? Our sun is a plasma. What we call the solar wind is a plasma. Now, NASA doesn't talk about plasma most of the time. NASA takes things that are technically plasma and calls it hot gas instead. So we all have this image of the solar wind as being like this hot gas that's streaming towards us. But you know what it is? It's a flow of electricity. It's a flow of electricity. Interstellar and interplanetary space, okay? Space is not an empty vacuum. It's actually filled with plasma of varying densities. So there's certain areas where the plasma is super diffuse, but then there's other areas where it becomes more concentrated. And it actually conducts sound. So this is another thing. So we're all walking around thinking, oh my God, space is vacuum, it's empty, and it doesn't conduct sound. It's not true, okay? Space is filled with plasma. And plasma actually conducts sound. It's called alpha waves, right? So you know how they've taken samples, how we can hear stars or hear the sun? Has anybody ever heard sounds from space? Don't you ever wonder, like, well, how do we hear that? Because sound doesn't travel through space, right? They measured it through the plasma. So sound does travel through space. These are nebulas, and these are all different arrangements of plasma. Lightning is a plasma. Northern lights. Okay, so when we get northern lights, what happens is the sun produces what's called a coronal mass ejection, or a CME, which hurls plasma through space at us. It hits our upper atmosphere, and because the charge has increased, because there's more electricity, it lights up. And there's names for that. This is something that I pulled off of Facebook. I gotta love Facebook for all these kinds of great little things. But basically what this is showing is that the way that plasma behaves in space, like, you know, the death of a star, the universe, they've shown that, you know, it's all connected through these filamentary strings. We'll learn about those. What a nebula looks like has an amazing visual correlation to the way when it starts to densify into matter. Right? So that's called fractal, with patterns repeating themselves at different scales. Oh, I was going to bring one of these today so you guys could play with it, but I forgot it. A Tesla globe, right? So you're a conductor, you put your finger on it, and the spark will draw to you. They've got a really big one at the Boston Museum of Science. Has anybody ever played with that one? Okay, other plasmas, so neon lights. Neon, you know, they hold a gas that when you put an electric charge in it, it lights up. Fire, yeah. Plasma has these different characteristics that we're going to talk about. And the reason why I go into such depth about it is because it's going to help us to understand the human energy field, or the biofield, okay? So plasma has very definitive characteristics. It forms what are called filaments, cells, and sheaths, all right? So high intensity electric current flowing through plasma takes on a spiral shape. And these actually go through space. That's one in the back. It's called a Birkeland current. And it's almost like wires. You know how we use wires to conduct electricity, right? These are the same things. This is high amounts of electricity that are going millions of light years across space in this uniform strip, basically. It forms double layer sheaths at outer boundaries of plasmas of different characters with a high electric charge between double layers, okay? So an example of that is the Earth's magnetosphere. You know, we have a sort of a double layer, that sort of ionospheric boundary that radio waves bounce off of. There is extra charge up there, and that is forming this protective bubble around the Earth that protects us from too much solar radiation. And then the sun has one too. It's called the heliosphere. So there's a big bubble around the sun. And there's this double layer sheath at the outer edge that forms that outer boundary. It's kind of like the skin of an orange. It's the idea, or an apple, right? You're supposed to eat the skin of things because it's got more nutrients in it, right? And again, this sort of fractal idea that to create a container of something, you need a boundary. And that boundary has more energy in it, okay? It forms cells of different voltages, temperatures, density, and chemical properties. So if you think about the atmosphere of the Earth, so we've got this little plasma bubble inside the bigger bubble of the heliosphere. We're probably in a bigger bubble that has to do with the Milky Way galaxy, right? So the bubbles within bubbles of different atmospheres, chemical compositions, and charges. It has different operation modes. So there's dark current mode, which is like our planet, the ionosphere. It doesn't usually glow unless we get hit with a coronal mass ejection, more electricity that will bring it into glow mode. And all of a sudden, we'll get northern lights. And then there's arc mode, which is a very strong current, and that's like sparks, lightning, plasma welders. Probably heard of those. There's also non-thermal or cold plasmas that are stable at room temperature. So plasma isn't just something that happens at very high heats. And this picture is a plasma device that helps to treat wounds, so it can kill bacteria. One night, when I was learning all about plasma, I was teaching my kids all about it at the same time, and I was putting my 9-year-old to bed one night, and he said to me, "Mom, if I had a wound and we put plasma on it, would it make it heal faster?" And I said, "I don't know, probably not." But then I went and Googled it, and I found that. And that's exactly what they're doing. In fact, they're using plasma flashlights for dental infections that can kill the bacteria in your mouth, and they're very inexpensive. So I said to my son, I was like, "How did you come up with that?" He was like, "Well, I was just thinking about it, and it seemed logical to me." I was like, "Okay, good." It's actually, the use of plasma in industry is really a growth industry at the moment. They're discovering all kinds of uses for plasmas. So in the course of learning about plasma, I actually learned about something that I didn't expect to learn about, but it actually changed my whole life. And basically what it is it's an entirely different way of looking at the universe. So we have a current cosmology that we've all been taught, which is Big Bang cosmology, that the universe started 13.7 billion years ago, and it began with nothing, which exploded for no particular reason, and it's been growing ever since. And the idea is that the second law of thermodynamics basically predicts that it's going to spread out and that's going to be the end of it. And in this cosmology, we have black holes, which are these things that suck in light, that devour light, is some of the ways that it's described. And then this mysterious, like, dark energy and dark matter. They're all, like, dark and mysterious. But when I came across electric universe theory, I read everything I could find on that. And basically what electric universe theory says is that electricity, not gravity, is the dominant force in space. And all of these things, like black holes and dark energy and dark matter, haven't really ever been seen. Basically what they are is mathematical constructs that have been invented to explain why galaxies hang together. Because there isn't enough gravity in galaxies to account for the fact that they hang together. So there must be some giant thing in the middle sucking, and then there has to be this other mysterious stuff on the outside pushing in, all right? But basically electric universe theory says this is the way electricity behaves, and it's scalable. So we can create this same phenomenon in the lab, and it explains all of this, and we don't need all of this math because this is the way electricity is. And it's actually creating this grassroots revolution in modern cosmology. So they're bringing many, many more people into the fold, because when you learn about electric universe theory, it makes sense. In fact, when I read this book called The Electric Sky, I've read a lot of self-help books in my life. I mean, I probably read hundreds, and always kind of felt like a seeker, because I didn't feel like I'd gotten the answers that I was looking for. When I read The Electric Sky, it was like the self-help book to end all self-help books. And it's not even a self-help book. It's the science of electric universe theory. And it dawned on me that the problem I was having, the sort of existential angst that wouldn't go away, was based in the cosmological story, that everything is separate. We have this image of ourselves in this, it's random chaos, and we're in this rock in the middle of nowhere, spinning meaninglessly through space, and nobody can hear you, because sound doesn't travel through space, and dark things gobble up light, and it's really depressing. It's really depressing without even really realizing it. And when I learned that everything is connected through this dynamic web of electrical plasma, I realized that I really was connected to everything. So that phrase, all is one, or everything is one, it sounds really woo-woo and really esoteric, and no, space is a vacuum, so it's not all one, right? Learning about electric universe theory and learning about plasma gave me a visceral sense of my connectedness to the rest of the universe. Like, this is just an interesting way of looking at it. So our sun, in the standard model, the thermonuclear sun is a thermonuclear furnace of hot gas that's burning itself out. It is completely disconnected from the rest of the galaxy and the universe, and it's blowing hot air, okay? So in the electric universe, the sun is a dynamic electric plasma that's powered by unlimited universal power source that's fed by these intergalactic Birkeland currents. And the solar wind is a stream of electricity from the positively charged sun to the negatively charged Earth. So it's a completely different model, right? It's this idea, it's like this thing that's connected to the rest of the universe. And for whatever reason, that put my mind at rest quite a bit. From the smallest particle to the largest galactic formation, a web of electrical circuitry connects and unifies all of nature, organizing galaxies, energizing stars, giving birth to planets, and our own world controlling weather and animating biological organisms. There are no isolated islands in an electrical universe, okay? So the same energy that powers the stars powers you, right? Carl Sagan, we are star stuff, contemplating the stars. We really are. Joni Mitchell, there you go. Plasma has a very dynamic relationship, and in the animation on the left, that is these Birkeland currents coming together, and they do this dance. So, everything is spin, right? Everything exists because it's in motion, because it's spinning. And I put this in, it doesn't relate so much to the talk, but it's something that I want to share because I think it's an important concept in it, and it has to do with this cosmology idea that again, coming back to the cosmology and the second law of thermodynamics, which predicts this dissipative heat death of the universe, okay? As my dad used to say all the time, it's all going down, right? It's like this belief in entropy, basically. In the 1940s, there was a Russian astrophysicist by the name of Kozyrev who was looking out into space, and he was like, you know what? That's not really happening, because I see things losing order over here, but then I see order arising over there, right? So it isn't just a continual loss of order. Entropy is the loss of order within a system, right? You throw a log in a wind stove, it burns, it's lost its order, and it's dissipated. So, he basically observed that, order might be lost here, but then it arises here. So this is a continual dance of what we call entropy, losing order, and then what the opposite of entropy is, which is the arising of order, the arising of galaxies, the arising of human bodies, right? The growing of babies, the growing of trees from an acorn to an oak, right? The creative force, the creative power that gives rise to things, right? Does anybody know what the scientific term for that is? The most amazing thing in the universe? Do you know what it's called? It's called negative entropy. I know. I refuse to use that term. So when I was doing research for my thesis, I read a book called Life Force, The Scientific Basis by a fellow named Claude Swanson. And he talks about negative entropy, or it gets shortened to neg entropy. And in my notebook, I took up a whole page and I said, we need a better word for negative entropy. And then I had the good fortune of actually going to a conference where he was a speaker. And at lunch one day, I was sitting down with him and another gentleman, and I was going through my notebook and I was asking him all these questions. And I got to that page and I was like, oh, we need a better word. And the other gentleman who was having lunch with us said, there is another word, and that word is syntropy, which I really like. So basically what this says is the universe it's not all going down. It's going down, but it's also coming up. And basically, you know what that makes it? It makes it a perpetual motion machine. But they don't want you to believe in those things. So you're taught it's all going down. So I just think that that's just an important, that there's this odd belief in the sort of Western mind that eliminates the life force, right? I mean, Western science is like, oh, there's no such thing as life force. Like, that's woo-woo, right? And we're going to call that negative entropy. Instead of recognizing, this arising that happens. There's something that arises. Yeah?
But the source of all the arising in our world is the sun, which puts energy into our system and makes it possible for us to grow and thrive, and everything that we see around us to grow and thrive.
Yeah.
But so the sun is the source of all that. And isn't the sun slowly burning itself out?
Well, not according to electric universe theory, right? That's the standard model that says the sun is burning itself out. Probably to some degree or another, like I'm not well versed enough, like an EU person could answer that perfectly for you. But basically the idea is, and they found this, that the sun is actually tapped into this universal power source. That there are actually Birkeland currents that connect to the outer edge of the heliosphere. So that the sun is being fed electrically by the rest of the universe. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right, always new ones arising. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So this is just a little diagram. The one on the left is an artist's rendition of a photon. So a photon is carrier of the electromagnetic charge, and it has a north pole and a south pole, so it's polarized, which means that each individual photon has a little plasma bubble around it, the magnetic field of the Earth, and then the heliosphere as well. So those are just examples of those plasma bubbles. So there is also terrestrial plasmas. So this was a very interesting thing that I came across, that actually I came across after months of digging, and it was really surprisingly hard to find. And that is that in addition to, obviously our upper atmosphere being charged, our whole environment within the magnetosphere is actually electric. And it flows like water does in these different pathways. So telluric currents are electrical currents in the Earth's surface. They cross land and water and are caused by the same phenomenon that generates the northern lights, the electricity from the sun, basically. These are scientifically mapped, thousands of miles long electrical currents flowing through continents. They were used to naturally power the old telegraph system in the United States with no need for man-made power supplies. Has anybody ever heard of a telluric current? You have, okay. So most people haven't heard of those, and when they hear this, they're like, really, right? So I was like, well, maps, I gotta find these maps. I'm really curious about this. You can't find the maps. You know who owns the maps? The oil and gas companies own all the maps, and they keep them under wraps. The fact that they even exist, you don't know about, right? So then I started to wonder, okay, if electricity flows in these flows, is that the same thing as what esoteric literature calls dragon lines or ley lines, right? Those energy lines? Could it be the same thing? And I've come to the conclusion that it is. That it's magnetic, it's just plasma, and it flows, and I actually found a line that goes through Johnson. There's a line that runs along the spine of the Green Mountains, about 80 feet wide. And then there's just like rivers, there's smaller ones, tributaries. People can find them with dowsing rods. And then I started wondering, okay, energy traveling along pathways, is that the same idea as like acupuncture meridians? Same kind of idea. Yeah, do you have a question? Well, you're told they don't exist. That's part of it. I mean, the people who use dowsing rods and work with dragon lines are marginalized, right? I mean, it's made into something that's really woo-woo. There are dowsers who've gone out and mapped things, but as far as I can see, there's been no real concerted effort to kind of get a real solid lay of the land. Actually, the line that runs across the Green Mountains actually goes through, we own 7 acres in Johnson, and it goes right through there. And I was like, well, can we harness this somehow to power our house to some degree, And I'm sure there's technologies out there where people have figured it out, but I haven't gotten that far yet. Yeah? Yeah, it creates geopathic stress. So, this particular line, the one that I'm familiar with, if you step into it when it's a full moon, if you have a full moon near like a, what is it, spring? Where can't I think of the word? An equinox, right? Stepping into that line is like stepping into a swift moving river. Like you can actually feel the energy flowing. It feels it's moving faster and it's cooler, and you can really feel it. And because it's energy, it's magnetism, right? It's electromagnetism. It amplifies things, right? So if you have a house that's built on a big flow, you might be more affected by moons and things like that. I had asked a local geomancer, a fellow named Patrick McManaway, who's from this area, about the wisdom of building in it. And he said, well, would you build your house in the middle of a river? I mean, this is a flow. And I definitely think that it can have a non-beneficial effect on people. It amplifies everything, yeah. Yeah.
Who made the original maps that you
Well, that's a good question. I think that we've been measuring the ambient electromagnetic field of the Earth, I think, for the last 150 years. And what they've noticed is that it's declining. So the strength of the ambient magnetism is in decline. And the fossil record points to the fact that it's actually been in decline for 4,000 years. So my thought is that, several hundred years ago, when there were less people, less noise, and the field was stronger, that it was much more obvious when you were encountering these structures in nature, Yeah, and dowsers were more respected, exactly. I mean, people use dowsing to find water, and, so now that I'm aware of this line, like, I'm really aware when I step in it, but I'm one of those highly sensitive people, and I had actually learned some stuff from Patrick McManaway about what to look for features in the land, and certain plants grow in them, and that's how I was able to identify it. But I think that people were just much more aware of them. In Australia, they're called song lines, and the Aborigines work with them and move with them, and, so, yeah. Right. Exactly, which is why I'm talking about it, because it's fractal, yeah. Okay, so basically everything is a form of condensed plasma when you get right down to it. Plasma becomes gas, becomes solid, becomes liquid. Okay, so here's where it gets where it starts to tie in, all right? So if you look at, the idea that the Earth has this magnetosphere, right? And in the lab, that's plasma. Then the human energy field kind of makes sense. You're electrical. Your heart is an electrically driven oscillator, produces an electric charge, produces a magnetic field. The way it looks in space and in the lab, it just fits in this sort of fractal idea. And then same with these other things, chakras, that I talked about earlier that are on the cover of my book, these energy centers, so that's where your nerve plexuses are. But if you put plasma through a plasma focus device, it ends up looking very much like what the, people who are seers, who are visionaries, who see these kinds of things, say a chakra looks like that. It looks like what plasma looks like when it's focused. Same with these, the filamentary currents, the way that electricity travels along these wires, right? The Birkeland currents, it's the same as how it's depicted in Chinese medicine, the meridians. In the Vedic tradition, there's this vision that you actually have these twin flows of energy that go up your spine. They're called the Ida and the Pingala, and they crisscross as they go up. And at every cross point, there is a chakra, or an energy center. It's the same idea, DNA, the other sort of twisting filaments that spin around each other and give rise to life. So I think it's safe to say, and you're certainly welcome to argue the point, that there is a subtle electromagnetic or bioplasmic field around the body. Now, people have been programmed to refute that in a couple different ways. One is that you don't produce enough electricity to throw a field that far, and that it's never been measured. Okay? However, there's been a device around since the late 60s called a squid magnetometer that has actually measured a magnetic field off the body at a distance of 12 feet. So it's a very diffuse magnetic field with a very low charge, but it has been measured. So I've kind of taken the Biofield hypothesis to the next level, and this is what I talked about earlier about it's a diffuse bioplasmic magnetic medium that stores the record of our life experiences in these standing wave formats that are encoded in standing waves. It's compartmentalized with the record of different emotional experiences being stored in different stratified locations throughout the field. Different emotions and different pathologies have different frequency signatures. So one of the ways that I describe my work is that I use sound like sonar. Like I ping it off of you, and I listen to it when it comes back, right? And so if something is functioning right, then the tone that it produces is clear, it sounds good. If it's functioning wrong, like let's say you have arthritis in a joint, okay? An arthritic joint sounds very different. The noise that it produces sounds very different than a healthy joint. A uterine fibroid makes a different sound than a uterus that doesn't have one. Pulled muscles. Any number of pathologies, they all have a particular frequency signature that they make. And so that's reflected in the overtones of the tuning forks. And it's the same, from person to person. So like different emotions have different frequency signatures. I actually discovered that we all think about how animals, like your dog, your cat, horses, right, that they all kind of speak the same language that you do on a vibrational level, right? Your cat or your dog knows when you're not happy. They sense that, right? Because they have resonance, because it matches them. They can feel that energy coming from you, and they know what that is. There's a certain knowing. I did some experiments with a friend where we actually, I did a tune-up on a couple plants that were hooked up to a polygraph machine in order to see how the plants would respond. And the first one I worked on was, it was a Brazilian medicinal plant, Amazon medicinal plant. And as I approached it with my tuning fork, I found the edge of its field and I started to move in towards it. Then the little meter that it was hooked up to started to go down. And the researcher said to me, oh, that's a sign that the plant is relaxing, like it likes what you're doing, right? So I hit this place where in my work there's a certain juncture you get to where there's a sort of a lightening or a sense of release where the adjustment that you're doing is complete. And I hit that with the plant, but then I struck the fork again and went back for another pass. And the plant immediately started to tense up. It was like, I thought we were done. What are you doing? Like the little needle started to go back up. So then I went on to the next plant, which was just a little bamboo plant. And as I approached that one, the needle didn't go anywhere. In fact, if anything, it started to edge upwards. But what I heard in the overtones of the tuning fork was the frequency signature that I associate with fear. And it has a very distinct frequency signature. It goes, right? So when you're really scared, you start to shake. And that's because the frequency of fear is that, okay? And when the amplitude gets really big, it actually moves your whole body. So I can hear that in the tuning fork. Well, I heard that coming off the plant. And I was like, wow. I was like, this plant sounds like it's afraid. And the researcher said to me, Eileen, you know what? I had this psychic in here last week. She works for the Colorado State Police. She's a really good psychic. And she told me that that plant was afraid. But what was stunning to me was it was the exact same frequency signature that I hear in people, which means that plants speak the same emotional language you do, right? If anybody's read the book, The Secret Life of Plants, where he talks about how he had the intention, he just had the thought that he was going to like light it with a match, right? And the plant went, wah! Right? It registered alarm because it could sense that. Yeah, it's pretty wild to think about. So it's timeline with information at the outer edge relating to gestation, birth, and information close. No, it was like, go away. I didn't. It was having none of it. Good. All right. So our electromagnetic bodies underlie our physical mechanical structure. So we all have been kind of conditioned to think of ourselves as sort of chemical mechanical, right? Drugs and surgery, it's all physical mechanical. But we've sort of left out this whole electromagnetic piece. The only reason you're alive is because your heart is electrically driven, okay? Your brain waves, it's all electric, right? But nobody really thinks about that or really even knows about that. So there's this other really interesting piece here, and this is what we call biophotons. So that they've discovered that DNA absorbs and emits biophotons, okay? Biophotons are information-packed quanta of light. Let's learn a little bit more of them. This coherent biophoton field, which permeates and envelops the solid body, is assumed to regulate and control all the life processes in the organism. Okay, so it's not just about this chemical signaling going on, but that you actually have a light body, right? Eat light, eat sunlight. Why? Because you got to keep your own inner sun, your own inner light lit up. This is why we eat light. I own the domain name Eat Light, Be Light. I also just bought the domain name, you guys will be the first to hear this, smallfarmdiet.com. Isn't that good? Because that's what we're all about here, right? This is the idea of eating a small farm diet. Okay. I have lots of domain names. I'm always dreaming up these things. Here's another definition of it. It's a holographic field of standing waves, which is able, through a broad spectrum of frequencies and polarizations, and in close interplay with all material structures, to transmit signals with the speed of light to any place in the organism, and to activate or to inhibit biochemical processes, to organize matter, and much more. Okay? So basically, it's your blueprint. You have this underlying electromagnetic blueprint that organizes and communicates. Very different model than this chemical one. So what they've discovered is that when a person is stressed, they actually shed biophotons. Okay? And so they've developed this technology, these biophoton counters and biophoton cameras. I'm in a PhD program in a school called the California Institute for Human Science, which is a unique little school that's set up to study the science of subtle energy and how acupuncture works and how these kinds of biofield therapies work, but from a very rigorous academic perspective. And so in my school, there is a biophoton counter that's in a room. It is a room that's made completely of copper. It is electromagnetically shielded. It's light-proof, and it's soundproof. And it has this biophoton counter that actually counts how many biophotons are coming off your skin at any given moment. And so I formed a hypothesis that this process that I call biofield tuning makes your biophotonic body more coherent. It makes it more in phase and organized. And so therefore, it should make you shed less biophotons, right? Like if somebody's a meditator and they count the biophotons coming off a meditator, they're way less than if somebody, just had a traffic accident and be shedding biophotons all over the place. So I took a class last summer and discovered, so this is the throat chakra of one of my classmates before a biofield tuning session. And this is how many, it's in the range of like 65 to 82 or 3 biophotons per second were being emitted, okay? So we did that test, and then I worked on her throat chakra, and I discovered that she had many issues around speaking from childhood. She was not allowed to speak. It was a kind of a children should be seen and not heard. So the left side in here holds when we have an impulse to speak or to express ourselves, and we censor and we hold it back. That energy, it's an electrochemical event. It's a thing when you have an impulse to express yourself. And if you suppress it, then that doesn't get expressed and it will accumulate, okay? A lot of people with low thyroid, it's because they're censoring all the time. They're not speaking up. So she had a tremendous amount of stuff over here, and then this side holds energy when we are speaking, but we're not being heard. We're not being acknowledged. I might as well be talking to a wall. That energy bounces back at you. It goes into like a spin here. So I cleaned all that up. This miraculous, tuning fork, combing, sweeping, taking all of those biophotons that had been lost during stress and centering them, putting them in phase and making them coherent. And then we did another run, and her biophoton emission decreased by 23%. So that was really fun to form a hypothesis and then actually get to test it and to see that what I think is happening actually might be happening. This is a bad slide. You can't really see it, but it's the significance of energetic imbalances. So does anybody have an ache or a pain anywhere in their body? And I can tell you what it might be related to. Do you want to say what it is? On the right or left side? Well, generally, what I find in the right hip, if people end up with issues in here, and I treat a lot of right hip issues, this is the hip of chronic overdoing. So if you have a busy mind or a busy body and you're always go, 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 and I think that I treat way more right hip issues than left hip issues. But almost without exception, everybody I've ever treated who's had right hip issues is a guilt-driven overdoer. Can't stop, must work, right? Whereas this side tends to hold energy when people become frustrated over not doing what they want to be doing. So, if you're busy doing what you don't want to be doing and not doing what you do want to be doing, it can, but you also might have one leg shorter than the other too. I mean, there are things that are purely biomechanical as well. Yeah, any other things? Really, you're pain-free? Yeah, that's very much the things we don't say or express. So, there's some things there that you're censoring, you're holding back, you're being nice or whatever, instead of just letting it out. I've really, I've developed a lot of slogans and mottos and all kinds of things doing this work. I've had such an interesting perspective on the human mind. Because what I've discovered in my work is that your mind isn't inside your body. Your body's inside your mind. Very different way of looking at things, right? And any place in your mind where you're out of balance or out of whack over time, especially when you get to be about 60, these things going on in your field, these unresolved things, these old traumas and whatever, start to encroach on the physiology. Those aches and pains of old age are just your mind, really. And you start to break down along the places where you have mental or emotional imbalances. There's somebody back there that was waving. Yeah. Right. Well, this area is what I call the gatekeeper, right around T5, and that's where, C5, right. Where T5. Oh, thoracic. That's about the back of the heart chakra. That's receiving love, being willing to receive love, letting in love. Any others? Yeah.
It's not an exact physical thing, but you have anything to say about starting projects
and not finishing them.
Yeah.
Yes, there's.
Even getting started.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what I call the 80% syndrome. It's people who start things but can't finish them, and it's not their fault. It's very often the impetus to set a goal and achieve it, and to have the energy to follow through happens through this part of the body. Okay, and this is the area that also holds the energy related to our parents. So in the Biofield anatomy, there's definite structures, and your mother and your father actually live in your field. And their energy is continually acting on you. So if you grew up in an environment where your parents were really chaotic and your home was really chaotic and there was just a lot of stress there and not necessarily support, then your third energy center is like and it's really hard to have the focus and the follow through to get things done. So this is one of the amazing things about this work, is that it takes all this energy that's stuck out in your field, it brings it together, and it makes it coherent. And I hear stories over and over again of people who were able to start and finish things, that they suddenly have the energy, as within, so without. So if you don't have, if you have a lot of chaos in your field, that's going to be reflected in your home, in your life, in your car. But if you have a lot of inner order and focus, then it's easier to keep your home clean, it's easier to move forward, and that sort of thing. So let me just wrap this up, and then I can take a few more questions. A harmonized, coherent biofield makes us less prone to disease, stuckness, knee-jerk reactions, having our buttons pushed, self-limiting beliefs, an overbusy mind, depression, and disconnectedness. And all of those things that if you're more harmonized, you flow, you get more in the flow of life and things are easier. What's the time? 20 minutes, okay. Good, so, yeah.
So the word tune-up comes to mind.
Tune-up, yeah, that's what we call them.
Yeah, so, I mean, it almost seems like a magic bullet, right? When I think about the slow, year-long process of psychotherapy that addresses our old patterns, and then I'm thinking about somebody just doing tuning.
Yeah.
I mean, how efficient is this over time? What happens?
I've had so many people say to me, I've gotten more out of 3 sessions with you than I did in years of therapy. Because we're moving these energy pathways. I mean, we're actually literally, just like a geomancer will move those energy streams so it's not going through your house anymore. Like, this is a real shifting of how things flow. You know, so if you've been flowing, like even just something like a tendency towards a busy mind, okay? You know when you lie awake at night at like 2:30 or 3 in the morning and your mind won't stop? You think it's happening here. You know where it's actually happening in your field? It's happening out here. Isn't that weird? This is where you are energizing yourself when your mind won't stop. And it's just a rhythm. It's a rhythm and a pattern. So I can hook into that energy flow, center it, and slow it down. And you know what? Your mind changes like that.
My follow-up question would be, so it doesn't matter whether or not you are, because in traditional healing techniques, there is that whole idea of bringing it to consciousness. And so you're saying that it's not even necessary?
No, it does. The work as I work with people, when I identify these, flows and rhythms that are off, I'll talk about what they are. So and sometimes things won't shift until they're identified. Sometimes there can be traumatic memories or things lodged in the field. But try as I might with my tuning fork, I can't get it to move until we do what we call retrieve the memory and identify it and witness that particular story, whatever it is. So there is an awareness piece that comes into it. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you treated people with ADHD?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't treat a lot of kids. It's just like, I teach at the college level, I'm kind of like grown-ups. Especially like 8 to 10-year-old boys are like monkeys, it's not so easy to treat them. But again, it's rhythm and flow, it's shifting rhythm, it's shifting focus, it's shifting the way things flow. And it just creates more focus. Yeah. No, that would be you.
I'm curious whether you've spoken with any musicians about this and what their implications might be for the people who've spent their lives making music.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have had some musicians as students. There's so much power in music. One of the things that I haven't talked about is intention. Part of this work is about intention, too. And sound is a carrier of intention. So there's so much that can be done with music if it's coupled consciously with intention. And I think that's a kind of a whole new frontier that hasn't been explored that much. So I think that learning about how sound affects the field in this way is inspiring to musicians, and when you really think about the intention you're putting out as you're generating music and how it's affecting people. In fact, one of the leading people in the sound healing field is a guy named Jonathan Goldman, who used to play in like a thrash metal band, and he started really paying attention to that whole equation of what was the intention here and what are we doing and how are we affecting people. He has a little equation that says sound plus intention equals healing. Yeah, yeah.
How does this therapy compare with chanting or mantras or yoga chants to balance things, or listening to mantras?
Yeah, it's the same idea. Any kind of sound therapy, sound healing has the same intention. It's to bring you to presence. It's to bring you into a place of relaxed, aware presence where you're not, freaking out about the past or freaking out about the future or in pain or distracted, but you're really here now. You're really able to show up in the present moment. And so chanting and mantra, there's very specific mantras. Has anybody ever seen a cymatics video? So this is something, if you like to research, write down cymatics and go to YouTube and search cymatics videos, and you can see how different frequencies give rise to different patterns in matter. And so, these very specific mantras give rise to... Absolutely. Yeah, it's Eastern music tends to be a little more intentional, especially Indian ragas and things like that, as far as exactly how the sound is influencing the body. Even just singing, singing pop music makes you feel better. It just does. Yeah.
How do you distinguish between, say, emotion and injury and maybe an unknown malady, one that isn't yet perceived, and their interplay, perhaps?
Yeah.
I'm sure it could get complicated.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's my students ask me that all the time. It's like a language, it's a language that I've learned over time, and I've learned to be like, oh, this is that sound, of, I just picked this up the other day, that when you're like 6 or 7 and you pee your pants in school or in front of people, like there's a particular feeling that goes along with that, and there's a frequency for that. Like, I said to the person, I'm like, did you, pee your pants in front of a bunch of people when you're like 6 or 7? She was like, how did you know that? I'm like, because it's a language, right? So sometimes it's hard, but oftentimes, like, I know, like, oh, this is scar tissue, this is a compression in the joint, it's all just a language. And so I've learned over the years to be able to tease those apart. How can I tell the difference between what I'm hearing from the liver or what I'm hearing from the kidney, adrenal? But they all have their own language, and it's just very subtle, but I've learned how to distinguish them. Yeah. I want to keep going because there's just a few more things that I want to share here. I'm going to be conducting an experiment that you're welcome to join in. So I had a very busy practice in Johnson, and then my book came out. And because I discovered that I can do this work at a distance. Now, people ask me for years, can you do this work at a distance? And I was like, of course I can't do it at a distance. Like, I'm using sound on the body. Like, this is physics, people. Like, how on earth would I do it at a distance? Well, that was my stance, my very skeptical stance, until a friend of mine convinced me to try a distance session on him, okay? He was in California. I was in Vermont. He said, just pretend I'm on your table, all right? So I did. And I was kind of reluctant to do it, but I did. And I approached the table pretending he was there and was completely stunned and blown away to discover the same kinds of patterns that show up when you're really there showed up. And I was able to read them, and I was able to manipulate them. And when we got on the phone afterwards, I was like, you had this at this age and this and blah, blah, blah. I'm really, really accurate because it's all a pattern and it's all a language, and I know it really well. And he was like, you're absolutely right. And not only that, but he experienced a state change as a consequence of that intervention. So then I started doing these distance sessions, and I've been doing them for a few years now. And what was happening when I was doing these distance sessions was I kept coming across the same patterns over and over and over again. A lot of my clients are women in their 60s, okay? And women in their 60s, baby boomers, what I was finding was the same pattern over and over. And what it was this was the first generation to be bottle-fed instead of breastfed. We're bottle-fed on a schedule, okay? Thank you, Dr. Spock. And as a consequence, their parents had PTSD, World War II. People were a mess after World War II, men and women alike. And the way that was managed was lots of drinking and smoking and taking Valium, right? So these babies were born, their moms were drinking and smoking and on Valium and giving them, propping them bottles. And so this pattern that I was seeing was in the left knee, failure to attach well. In the left hip area, frustration over unmet needs, okay? You're not getting what you need. You're not getting skin-to-skin contact. You're not getting breast milk. It's very frustrating, okay? There's a certain sadness that goes along with all of that was happening. And what I discovered in this particular pattern was this tendency, this frustration over unmet needs turned into stomach aches as a kid, turned into this whole thing. I saw this continuity that happens all the way through, that so many of the digestive disorders faced by the baby boomers go all the way back to bottle feeding. Because when you get breast milk, it seeds your digestive tract with all those healthy bacteria, right, that we were talking about earlier. And if you don't get those, you don't have the colonies in there to help you to digest. So all of the irritable bowel and the this and the that goes back to bottle feeding, which I never in a million years would have put together if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, okay? Now, I'm a researcher. I like discovery. And when I kept seeing the same stupid pattern over and over again, it was getting boring. And I was like, maybe I'm going to save time and like do a whole bunch of people all at once. So I did an experiment where 140 people decided to participate, and I acted as if they were just one body. And so all these people were at home, and they tuned into my treatment table in Johnson, Vermont, and I approached the table as if it was one body and started working on all 140 people. And what happened as I was working was every time I would make an adjustment and bring the energy into the energy center, that kind of click, drag, and drop thing, a wave of heat came into the room, which was just really wild. And by the time we were done, the temperature had gone up like, I don't know, it felt like 7 or 8 degrees. So that was really wild. And I was like, the scientist in me was like, data points. This is a way to possibly record this, okay? So I did one more group distance session. I had about 200 people in that. That one we did on the phone, where people could call in and actually listen to me working on them. And what happened in that was I found these structures in the collective field that were so big and so difficult. And I said to people on the phone, I'm like, how about if you all help each other to get over this, immovable obstacle? And the energy shifted right away, which just blew my mind. I was like, wow, I can get people to like connect through the ethers and help each other. And the stories that I got back gave me goosebumps. I mean, it was really mind-blowing, people's experiences that they had during that group work. So I'm doing one more, and I'm doing it in the copper room with the biophoton counter on June 18th. I'm going out to California. I've got several hundred people signed up already. And I'm going to have on June 18th at 3 p.m. California time, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we are all going to show up. Your etheric bodies are going to show up in that room, and I'm going to have a thermometer and a biophoton counter, and we'll see what happens. So what I've read is that in other experiences where they've done distance healing in these rooms with biophoton counters, they've experienced bursts of biophotons. That was with one body. So I think with 500, we might, we probably won't have quite that many. Actually, I did, in the first one, I did get some electric surge and had consequences from it. And I had to adapt for the next one in order to manage that, yeah. It is electricity, it's real. So the mechanism for, how do you do that? How do you put your photonic body 3,000 miles away? And that has to do with ether. So ether has been taken out of our cosmology. Ether is seen as it's an invisible field that's everywhere all at once, and it contains everything, basically. And we've all been taught, just like you didn't learn about plasma, right? Solid, liquid, and gas. But there's plasma, and then there's ether, this underlying medium. And your consciousness can go under here, and it can pop up in that room through this ether. And we all have the experiences of etheric connection, right? Your phone rings, you know who it is. Things like that. So, and we talk about it. We use it in our our words through the ethers. And I could talk a lot about ether. In my book, I really go into all of this in detail, so you can learn a lot more about ether. But it's through the ether that you can show up in California. So if anybody wants to sign up for that, you can do that. I'll put you on my mailing list. And then lastly, I've just formed an institute, which is really exciting. The Biofield Tuning Institute is a nonprofit organization. And I'm really interested in, the science of all of this and how we can take something like tuning fork healing and actually bring it down to earth and really quantify it. So one of the things we're going to be doing is a 10-week study on veterans. The things that veterans suffer from, anxiety, PTSD, that sort of thing. This is such a simple, non-invasive, effective intervention. And I'd really love to see it being used by the VA. But they need quantification. So we want to do a preliminary study on veterans. And then I also want to develop a technology that is based on this. The idea that you have this varying terrain around your body and these frequency signatures of different pathologies. I think that if we could take this information and render it visible on a screen, that it would go a long way towards making it just become an accepted part of our approach in dealing with people, because it is so effective and it is so efficient. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. is the institute. So if anybody's interested in more information about that, you can also sign up for the mailing lists. So that's it. All right. So what do we have for time? Do we have a few more minutes for questions, or are we done?
We have 5 minutes, and then I'm hoping that we can have a quick stretching break, and then Mayfield is going to start speaking at 8:30.
Okay, yeah. I think that, yeah, she wanted to know what happens to your plasma when you die. I think that the etheric record is stored in the ether, but the plasma dissipates. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering what the effects of all the different electromagnetic, how different electromagnetic or just electronics affect all of this, and like induction stoves or wireless internet or cell phones.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely does, you know, and some people are more sensitive than others. You know, I've found that our adrenals are actually kind of, you know, in Star Trek, you have to put your shields up, right? I think that our adrenals actually, like, strengthen our shields. And when people go into adrenal failure or adrenal fatigue, their shields get weaker, and they become more vulnerable to electromagnetic fields. As long as you're strong and healthy, it's like the heliosphere of the sun or the magnetosphere of the earth, you're kind of protected. You're sort of buffered. But when people become really sick and their shields go down, then electromagnetic fields, they disrupt intercellular communication. Yeah?
I was just wondering if you ever studied the Native American chanting, you know, for healing, or using the didgeridoo.
Sure. I mean, you know, I've looked into all of that. And, you know, the whole sort of Native American tradition of rattling around the body or drumming around the body or singing makes perfect sense in the context of the biofield and the idea that you have stagnant energy within the field, you know, that is creating certain patterns or certain feelings. Rattles, drums are the same as tuning forks. They break it up. They get it moving. You know, certain songs cause energy to respond in certain ways. It's very logical when you think about it, even though we've been conditioned to think of it as primitive. Yeah. Yeah. I've treated a number of people with skin disorders and had it clear up right away. Hives can clear up right away, rashes. Things like psoriasis and eczema are a little harder, but have had some success with them. Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned infrasound, and until a year and a half ago, I had never heard of it. And the reason I heard of it is because some people around Lowell Mountain,
Exactly.
Georgia Mountain,
Yeah.
because of the industrial wind turbines, and they live closer to those wind turbines,
Are being subjected to
complain,
infrasound.
and the establishment poo-poos them and says they're kooks. So what is infrasound, and how could it be connected to these huge
Right.
wind turbines?
Well, I actually went to visited a family at each site and used my tuning forks to listen to their fields to hear what had happened. In several of the people, their systems had been entrained to the rhythm of the blades. So that woo, woo, woo kind of sound was actually happening in their body, which means that it was interrupting all their other signaling. It was horrible what I saw happen. Infrasound is sound below the level of hearing, but it creates low pressure. So part of what people are experiencing with the pressure in the head is this infrasonic low frequency that is like a low pressure system that they're constantly being subjected to. It's part of the reason why people get motion sickness as well, is infrasonic sound. Yeah.
Is that similar to like ghost energy from your appliances and so?
Yeah, dirty energy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be a reason to shut or unplug.
Yeah, unplug the Wi-Fi and things like that. Yeah, because it disrupts your own signaling. Yeah. Okay, last question. Lack of support from the father. What does gallbladder pain signify? And it's lack of support from the father. Good. All right. Okay, thanks, folks.